In this, our second video on our Baptist history study, we're going to take a look at the relationship between Martin Luther and the Anabaptists. We talked last night in our church history study on the life of Martin Luther, or at least started to, and since we're looking at the same time at the history of the Baptists, I wanted to find a way to link them. Martin Luther, who is not a Baptist, and the Anabaptists, the first Baptists. As we've established, the Anabaptists had two things going against them as far as trying to gain acceptance among either Catholics or Protestants. First of all, they denounced infant baptism. They insisted on baptism only of professed believers, which ended up working against them both, because the idea of, as they called it, rebaptizing seemed ludicrous to Catholic and Protestant alike, but also because at that time, baptismal records were the chief, and in some places only, means by which to assess the population of a city or a nation. So logically, if you stop baptizing infants, it becomes vastly more difficult, if not impossible, to know how many people live where. But second, they also advocated for the total separation of church and state. And while this came out of concern about the abuses of the church as far as using the state as sort of their law enforcement wing of the church, no one, Catholic or Protestant, could at that point imagine a world where the state did not implement the decrees of the church. And even the name Anabaptist was not the invention of those who were called Anabaptists. The word Ana comes from a Greek root functionally meaning to do again or to repeat. So in other words, they were re-baptizers. And in that time, when your theological position as an individual or as a movement is slapped with a label like that, it is always meant in a derogatory way. And the name Anabaptist itself even worked against them as well from a political perspective. Because at this time in history, the law code of Justinian, the Emperor Justinian, from the first millennium of the church, the law code of Justinian is still in play in most of the West. And the Code of Justinian explicitly states that anyone who re-baptizes someone is subject to death. So if both the Catholics and the Protestants are going around calling you a re-baptizer, you are not just playing with fire simply because of what you believe about infant baptism or separation of church and state. You're also playing with fire because continuing to hold specifically to the idea of believers' baptism over and against infant baptism has now earned you a title that, if taken seriously in the eyes of the law, could wind up costing you your life. And if you remember last week when we talked about the Anabaptists to begin with, and the incident at the town of Munster in 1534 when fanatical Anabaptists took the town by force, Anabaptists also had this image of violent fanaticism now associated with them as a result. The point being that it's not exactly in your best interests to be considered a violent outlaw, which at that time the Anabaptists were. So knowing these things the Anabaptists believe that politically work against them, where does Martin Luther come into play? Well, whether you have ever read personally any of Luther's works, or if you've simply heard about, namely what his personality was like in terms of what when he was dealing with what he saw as error, you can imagine that Luther did not take kindly to these theological oddities. We'll see in our next session in the church history study next week that for as much good as he did in his life, Luther also did a lot of things that were very damaging to his reputation, both then and now. And several of those damaging things came from some of the negative works or treatises that he wrote against those that he believed were in error. And just to kind of give you a hint of what's to come next week, some of Luther's more infamous works include such titles as Against the Murderous Thieving Hordes of Peasants, On War Against the Turk, Turk being an alternate name in that time for Muslim, and perhaps most infamously, On the Jews and Their Lies. Luther did not mince any words when he got worked up about something, and this was just as true with the Anabaptists. Some of his writings and his sermons against them say things like this. Basically, since our baptizing has been thus from the beginning of Christianity, and the custom has been to baptize children, and since no one can prove with good reasons that they do not have faith, we should not make changes and build on such weak arguments. So basically combining the myth believed then and now that the church has always, since its earliest days, baptized infants, which is not actually based in historical record, but also an outworking of the notion that we cannot say anything negative about the potential state of someone's salvation because only God judges the heart. And the result of this combination of the two is that Luther is basically saying, as far as we know, it's always been this way. And as far as we know, they could be saved, so we're not going to bother changing anything. Which, to me, sits sort of in the middle of a spectrum between theological laziness and theological irresponsibility on either end. He also said, on the other hand, we cannot prove that children do believe with any scripture verse that clearly and expressly declares in so many words, or the like. You are to baptize children because they believe. Whoever compels us to produce such a statement has the upper hand and wins, for we cannot find such words. But sincere and sensible Christians do not require such proof. The quarrelsome, obstinate, rebellious spirits do in order to seem clever. But on their side, they can produce no statement which says, you are to baptize adults, but not children. We are, however, persuaded by many good reasons to hold that child baptism is right and that children do believe. So again, walking the line between laziness and irresponsibility, basically saying we can't find a verse that says the exact words as to one way or another, and anyone who needs those exact words is a stubborn idiot. So Luther was exceedingly good, not at burying people's arguments with wave after wave of biblical proofs and theological sensibility. Not this. Most often he was particularly good at just insulting people that seemed disagreeable for whatever reason he found in them. And honestly, if you really want to do a modern comparison between Luther and someone today as far as that attitude, sadly the closest resemblance is probably something we'll call the internet atheists. People who spout off insults about Christianity purely because they find it disagreeable. Someone like a Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, who find their opponent so contemptible as to be worthy of somewhere between the utmost ridicule and death. And like I said from the outset, for all the good things that he did, and there were a lot, Luther did many other things we cannot brush under the rug or look the other way on. He may have had his reasons for some of the criticism that he voiced, like the ones that folks will throw out about how his on the Jews and their lies really shouldn't be worried about that much, because Luther was just mad at them for not believing in Jesus, even though that's still not an acceptable reason. But perhaps more so than any of the other reformers, Luther more frequently resorted to childish insult as opposed to biblical correction. And as we've seen today, this was just as true with the Anabaptists, and therein lies our link.